This is the Temp Nutrition Channel. I'm Elizabeth, a registered dietitian and nutritionist. My goal is to offer workable, realistic ways to improve nutritional health. The 4 phases of diabetes.
Diabetes, or diabetes mellitus to give it its full name. It comes from the Greek, which means honey-tasting urine. This is a disease where people are spilling sugar into their urine because it's so high in the blood. But diabetes is not just one homogeneous disease. It comes in many different flavors, different diagnoses. Now they suggest that there's actually 4 separate diagnoses for diabetes. The first is juvenile onset diabetes, the kind that children get. There's also a new type called diabetes 1.5. This is a diabetes that develops later in life, but is very similar to type 1 diabetes, but maybe not quite so severe. Then there's type 2 diabetes. This is what we all think about when we say diabetes. It's a diabetes of insulin resistance. And lastly, there's type 3 diabetes. They're starting to show that if you give the brain more insulin, people with Alzheimer's, just mild Alzheimer's, do better. So what is insulin? Insulin is a short little protein that is very important. Your body uses it to regulate the distribution of sugar and energy in your body. You can think of it as little keys that allow the glucose or the blood sugar to leave the bloodstream and enter the cells. Your pancreas is secreting insulin very slowly throughout the day and night. And then, after a meal, when blood sugar goes a little higher, it sends out more insulin so that all that extra energy and sugar can be distributed to the various cells that need it. Type 1 diabetes. This is considered an autoimmune disease. It usually happens after an illness when your immune system goes a little crazy and attacks your pancreas, killing all the cells that produce insulin. People with type 1 diabetes make no insulin. So if you think about my little analogy, it's like the little person. There are no keys. The sugar cannot leave the blood. This condition was always fatal before 1921. At that point, they found out that using insulin from animal pancreases could help these people control their blood sugar. In 1982, we were able to find a way of making E. coli make human insulin, and so we no longer rely on animal insulins. The only treatment for type 1 diabetes is insulin. There are no other medications. This is the kind of diabetes where they say you start on insulin and you will stay on insulin. There's a new type of diabetes that they're calling type 1.5. It's very similar to type 1 diabetes, except it comes on later in life, and usually it's not quite so severe. Sometimes people with type 1.5 diabetes still have a small amount of insulin production, just not enough. Sometimes this is mistaken for type 2 diabetes. This type of diabetes is better treated with insulin because it helps preserve the pancreas. Type 2 diabetes. That's what we all think about when we think about diabetes. And in type 2 diabetes, there's plenty of insulin. As a matter of fact, people with this kind of diabetes usually have more insulin than people who don't have diabetes. It's just that there's resistance. If you think about my analogy, you could think about the cells as having more keyholes, more locks on all their doors, so that it becomes harder to get in, to move the sugar out of the blood and into the cells because the cells are resisting. And this resistance is also fairly changeable. Sometimes the doors are locked and sometimes they're not. Insulin resistance goes up as we get older, as we get heavier. It goes up with bigger meals and when we are stressed. By that I mean being ill, having surgery, or even not getting proper sleep. But it also goes down when you lose weight, when you exercise, when you make your meals smaller. It's changeable. But this is the most common form of diabetes, and there are lots of treatments for it. There are medications that make the cells more sensitive to the insulin. There are medications that help the pancreas boost its production of insulin. There are medications that slow down the absorption of food from the intestinal tract so that the food comes more slowly and lowers insulin resistance. And then lastly, there's extra insulin, which also works fine. Type 3 diabetes. This is an experimental diagnosis and it's not widely accepted yet. But they're finding some really interesting correlations. If you give people insulin as an inhaler, it goes to the brain and not the bloodstream. And people with Alzheimer's are showing improved function. So this is very hopeful. There's also a close correlation between diabetes and dementia. I think it's important for us all to know that diabetes is not a homogeneous disease, that there's very different aspects to diabetes. Depending on what type we have, we should be treating it differently. But there's one thing that is a constant amongst all of these forms of diabetes. Is the better you regulate your blood sugar, you keep them under good control, the longer and healthier your life will be. If you like this, please subscribe to my channel, Temp Nutrition.